strengthen a peaceful solution to the unrest. That's according to the Kremlin. Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov says that Western countries are trying to stir up Syria's opposition to topple President Bashar al-Assad. Let's get the latest now on this constantly developing story with RT's Peter Oliver. Peter, Moscow has been trying to mediate a peace deal in Syria for months now. Why does the Kremlin think that Western countries are pulling in the other direction?
Well, Sergei Lavrov has said in a statement expressing Russia's dismay at the decision to suspend Syria from the Arab League. He said that with Russia's help and advice, President Assad has been implementing the reforms that were put forward by the Arab League in a meeting on the 2nd of November, in a peace deal, a deal to try and broker peace in the Syrian conflict. Now, Sergei Lavrov has said that the decision to suspend Syria from the Arab League is counterproductive to a peace deal, saying that this decision really sends a message to the Syrian opposition to continue fighting against President Assad and the pro-government forces in Syria, and not getting them to the table to discuss a peaceful resolution to this. Now, Russia has tried to mediate in the past and has offered its services. Representatives from both the Syrian leadership and the Syrian opposition have been here in Moscow for talks, and in fact in the next couple of days a senior Syrian opposition member will be here in the Russian capital for further talks to try and bring about that peaceful solution. Now, what we are hearing from Lavrov is some quite strong words suggesting a spectre, a ghostly image of Western, shadowy image, sorry, I beg your pardon, of Western influence towards the decision to suspend Syria from the Arab League. Something that Russia does not want to see. They are against that decision, which is expected to be rubber stamped in an emergency meeting from the Arab League on Wednesday. Russia wants to see a continuation of their policy of trying to find a peaceful solution to the situation in Syria.
Now, Peter, as you were mentioning a moment ago about the Arab League voting to suspend Syria from their organisation, Damascus in turn then invited the Arab League to send all sorts of observers to the country. What comes next, though, if that doesn't happen and the two sides just can't sort this dispute out?
Well, it's a tricky situation at the moment. What we're seeing is on Wednesday we're expecting to see that rubber stamp put on the decision to suspend Syria from the Arab League. Now, the last nation to be suspended from the Arab League was Libya, and of course that resulted in the outside military intervention, something that Russia again was opposed to, a military intervention that went far beyond the parameters that were laid out in UN resolutions, and something that Russia voiced strong opposition towards. And when it came to the chance of imposing a UN resolution on Syria, Russia abstaining from that and blocking that decision from going through. What we have seen is further sanctions being put forward from outside of the Arab League. The EU have suggested they want to see further sanctions. Also, they want to see, we expect to see this go through very shortly, the freezing of assets of 18 senior members of Assad's government, Syrian, personnel, political personnel and military personnel. We've also seen the reaction from the Syrian people to this. Tens of thousands out on the streets of Damascus and across Syria protesting against this decision to suspend Syria from the Arab League. Some of those protests taking place outside the embassies of Saudi Arabia and Qatar, two nations which voted to suspend Syria from the League. Now, we're seeing anger from the Syrians from this decision to suspend them from the Arab League, and they want to find a peaceful solution to put an end to this conflict that's gone on for 8 months now, with an estimated 3,500 people being killed during it.
All right, RT's Peter Oliver there, live from the centre of Moscow. Thank you. Let's get some more perspective on this developing story from independent web journalist James Corbett joining us now live. Thank you for coming on the programme today. Libya was also kicked out of the Arab League just before it was targeted by NATO airstrikes. So how far are we from seeing the same happen to Syria? A lot of parallels are being drawn at this point.
Well, given the incredible diplomatic and political ramifications of this move, I think we can't be too far from seeing a similar type situation playing out as what played out in Libya. And I think it's absolutely almost inconceivable now to really see how Assad can maintain power given the circumstances and given the, as I say, the incredible diplomatic ramifications of this with all of the Arab League nations now assuming that this is rubber stamped as we believe it will be. This decision will mean the withdrawing of important diplomatic embassy officials from Damascus, which really does delegitimize the government there in a major way. So it's almost inconceivable to see how Assad would be able to stay on in power in any event right now.
If we take a broader picture here, when it comes to Tunisia, Egypt and Libya, we've seen Islamist forces are strengthening their positions in those post-revolution countries. How likely is that, do you think, to happen in Syria?
Well, I think that would have to be one of the likely outcomes of this, given the destabilization of the regime, which, of course, has tried to maintain a socialist secular state in that country for a long time. To see the destabilization of that, one would assume that the long repressed Sunni majority in the country, once in power, would try to assert more of an Islamic influence over the government of that country. So one would assume that would be a logical consequence of what we see playing out right now.
Now, Russia and China have already vetoed a UN Security Council resolution that did target Damascus. But do you think the enemies of President Assad really need a UN mandate to bring him down?
Certainly not, and I think Iraq would be the obvious parallel in that regard. Certainly no UN mandate was necessary in that regard, because a coalition of the willing, or whatever term can be invented, can be invented in order to provide some sort of justification. So I think we very much could see a similar thing playing out here, and of course the Arab League suspension would be I have no doubt would be offered as one justification for that type of move.
Now, the West has been very selective in its stance on Syria. Even when thousands rally in support of President Assad, the West still wants regime change. What do you think has happened to respecting the aspirations of the Syrian people? Regardless of what those aspirations may be, it seems that there just seem to be perhaps a few power players here dictating the final outcome of events.
Well, that's exactly right, and I don't think I think all this does is speak to the lie of the notion that there was ever any consideration for what the people of Syria really want. Certainly, we see that playing out right now with Syria and with the thousands of people who are protesting in favor of the Assad government. Exactly as we saw earlier this summer, we saw hundreds of thousands, potentially even more, protesting in Tripoli in support of the Gaddafi government. But that obviously had no effect on the rhetoric that was taking place in the West. And we see this reflected in mainstream coverage of these events in Western mainstream sources in the last few days. You can see pictures of the thousands of people who are demonstrating in favor of the Assad government, alongside stories about how the government is repressing and killing its citizens. So the disconnect is there, but obviously the rhetoric is just not going to reflect that in any way.
Well, certainly we've seen reports over the past week or so that from people on the ground in Damascus saying tens of thousands of people are showing up to support President Assad, but then it actually gets flipped on the Western media. They say 500,000 are there protesting against Assad. It certainly does seem to be a rather interesting mix coming from East and West media outlets. Now, Russia has been actively trying to mediate peace in Syria for months. What sort of impact do you think can international peace efforts really make at the end of the day?
Well, one would hope that there would be something that could be accomplished here, but as I say, I really don't see a way for the Assad government to maintain its current foothold clutch on the country, given the way that things are unfolding. Certainly, Russian or Chinese overtures in that area would be, I suppose, helpful in this regard, but I certainly don't know if it's going to make any fundamental difference. In the same way that no amount of protest over what was taking place in Libya really seemed to derail that agenda, and we do tend to keep going back to Libya as the example, but I think it's the obvious analog to what we see happening right now in Syria, and unfortunately, if that's the case, I think there's nothing, not even facts that are later exposed about how a lot of the things that have been said in the run-up to this are false, like was the case in Libya. I don't think that would even derail the agenda as it seems to be playing out right now, and now with this Arab League suspension, I think we see a dangerous new moment where really a new, perhaps even a military military intervention is definitely on the table.
Well, you bring in the issue of military intervention. It's interesting here because with allegations of Western countries fanning the flames in Syria, there are some people that say, well, look, Iraq had oil, Libya had oil. What does Syria have that could in some way entice Western powers to get involved here? Or is it not necessarily an issue of mineral wealth, but perhaps regional advantages there?
I would say it tends to be geostrategic and regional, and I continue to posit that the Syrian intervention, if it should come, would be seen, I think, most obviously in a type of play on Iran, perhaps a pre-strike on Iran, because obviously the destabilization of the Syrian regime would further isolate Iran, which is already surrounded by NATO forces, if you actually look at the map. But of course this would cut off its land bridge to Lebanon, which would be absolutely a very loss of a key partner for the Ahmadinejad government. So I think the Syrian intervention would have to be seen in the context of the greater preparation for an attack on Iran, which of course we've seen the rhetoric for that ramping up quite a bit in the last few weeks.
Very interesting how you bring in the Iran angle on that last question. Independent web journalist James Corbett, that's all the time we have for today. Thank you.
Thank you.